Hi guys, and welcome to your first screencast, which is going to give you a bit of a historical background to Cloudstreet. Basically, Mr. Bosley and I thought it was really important that you had a bit of an understanding of the historical context for Cloudstreet before you came back to class, because we really wanted to get really stuck into it. So here are some of the things that you need to make sure you understand before you come to class. Basically, Winton in his writing has assumed that you as a reader will have some understanding of how World War I and II impacted on Australian society, and even then how the Cold War, which is happening while Cloudstreet is happening, how the Cold War affected the lives of Australians as well. You need to have a bit of an understanding of poverty and the Australian working class life. This concept of class warfare, which is something that actually we don't really understand or have too much of a concept of now, but it's very prominent in Cloudstreet. The drift in Australian life from the bush to the cities, growth of Perth, religious divisions, post-war immigration, gender discrimination and the changing roles of women, which is actually also really linked to World War II as well, and Aboriginal history. So I'm going to get through as much as I can in the next 10 minutes, but you might need to stay tuned for part 2 as well. Okay, so in terms of World War I, you really need to know about how Gallipoli has laid the foundation for Australian identity. So even if you know nothing about the dates or anything about Gallipoli, hopefully from all of our Anzac Day celebrations, you will have picked up one of these core themes of mateship. This was really a founding principle of the Australian identity. That, along with the idea of persevering, all these kind of ideas started to form the Australian identity after World War I. Okay, so this is evident in Cloudstreet as well, where the effects of the war are still very present and strongly felt in the novel. But yeah, it's really important that you understand that the male characters are very much influenced by this Gallipoli identity of like mateship and persevering through the toughest times and things like that. Okay. It was a defining event for the older generation in Cloudstreet, and it really does mark a generational gap between them and their children. So basically it's like the parents experience this horrific time, and it's really difficult for children to understand that. It's difficult for parents to convey what that means, and it definitely has an impact on the relationships between those two generations. As dot point 3 says, people are judging themselves and others based on their participation in the war or lack thereof. Okay, so we have Oriel's rationalised indignation at the signs at GM Clay Shop. So this is part of the story where it becomes really obvious that it's important whether or not you participated in the war and how you participated in the war. Oriel loses her brother Bluey in the war, and we see that as a reaction to this, she marries Lester because he, in a way, reminds her of her brother. So we even see that characters' key decisions are influenced by the war. And then we even have this kind of weird thing happening where Lester, Oriel's husband, he almost doesn't measure up. He's never going to be as good as Bluey because he didn't die in the war. So because he didn't make that ultimate sacrifice, he also has to kind of deal with the implications of that. So the Anzac Club as well plays a role in the, that's like the RSL, the Returned Servicemen's League, plays a role in this story as well. Yeah, so just you need to have an understanding of how the war has influenced society, particularly in terms of forming identity. And then, of course, we have World War II as well. So we see a bit of a change in Australia's national identity, which is affecting the characters too. So we go from being a totally British Empire-dominated country to this idea where we actually reorient ourselves towards reliance on the USA. And that comes from the Pacific War aspects and Australia's relations to the US, relying on the US protection from the Japanese as they head further and further south. And then we also see how World War II is beginning to affect the younger generation. So quick as he encounters images from concentration camps in the newspapers, that actually has an effect on his character. So we see that World War II is kind of introducing that war theme to the younger generation as well. We also see how World War I further helps Australia form its national identity, because you've got to remember that Australia in the early 1900s, early 20th century is a very young country and still trying to figure out who we are as a country. So World War One begins that sense of national identity. World War II sees us finishing our relationship with the British Empire so much, even though we're obviously still part of the Commonwealth, but we really try to become our own nation. And this is where the lifelong alliance with the USA really begins. Yeah, cool. And of course we see the Cold War beginning at the end of World War II, pretty much starts straight away. And this is where things like the nuclear age and the sense of looming disaster and this concept of MAD, mutually assured destruction, comes into play, with society really feeling like they're living on the edge of annihilation. What a great word. But it has an influence on the characters as well, as I'm sure you will see. There's also this fear of communism, which plays out in the Cold War. And this is translated into a fear of Asia and Asian migration. And that's because a lot of the Asian countries are becoming communist, so that's where that comes in. In terms of Australian understanding of poverty, I think we could really see that come through in the way the families live their lives, having to share houses and things like that. But we have kind of two distinct experiences of poverty. One where families really prepared to be poor. The lambs don't seem to mind it too much. And then we have this other side with the gambling and things like that, where there just seems to be a different kind of understanding of the value of money. And this is really interesting because both Oriel and Sam's generation have lived through the Great Depression. So that was immediately following World War One. They've had to live through the Chifley government introducing safety nets, so the PBS, which is to do with public health and public housing. So that change happened kind of while Oriel and Sam were adults. So they've lived without those kind of benefits as well. Rationing continues in the years after World War II, and you really see that in the way that Oriel has to provide meals, and even with Rose cooking and things like that, you see how rationing really influences their lives. And then we have this class warfare theme coming through, which is something that we don't really have to think too much about this, I don't think. Well, I don't think too much about it anyway. But we have an Australia that's just divided along class lines, and we see this particularly portrayed through the working class representation of families. So Sam as a character, Sam Pickles, he really portrays what a working class man is, and we have even mention of Prime Minister Menzies, who is in power, as you can see, from 39 to 41 and then 49 to 66, and he was a conservative PM, and traditionally conservative PMs will care more about kind of traditionally speaking, those who are making more money and things like that, whereas your Labor PMs or a Labor government aligned more with the working class man. So we see Sam's opinion on Menzies is quite low. And this is, so Winton is actually praised for his portrayal of a working class family in Cloudstreet. So it's interesting, important to think about how Winton actually portrays this working class family and what they're like. We also see, in terms of the bosses and the police versus the workers, so Rose's reaction to Quick's choice of work. So whether or not you've got up to this, but we actually, when Quick decides to become a police officer, Rose is a bit cautious, and this is to do with her prejudice against policemen, really, because it was kind of a working class job. And we also see Sam's there's some quotes to do with Sam's tendencies and thoughts about unions. So unions were a way of banding working class men together. So if there's anything worse than one working class man, it's a union of working class men, and they were all after the same kind of thing, which was very, very different to what Prime Minister Menzies would have preferred. We also see this fundamental shift. It says shiz on the page there, but it should say shift in Australian life from the bush to the city. So this migration, this rural to urban migration, is actually a really fundamental part of Australia's history. And we see it both with the Lambs and the Pickles moving to Perth. So Perth was, even though it's small in comparison to somewhere like Melbourne, it was really an urban centre in Western Australia. There's not much else happening there. And we also see that when Quick then returns to the bush, hopefully you know what I'm talking about, when he then returns to the bush, it's catastrophic, and it just is a really bad experience for him. So we see that this part of Australian life, moving from the bush to the city, Winton's done a really good job of portraying this as well. And of course, as people migrate from the country to the cities grow, and with the city growth comes things like the need to build, and that's where we see people wanting to buy Cloudstreet, and also this interesting character, the Nedlands Monster. This was a serial killer that's actually based on a real life serial killer, and we have that quote there where they say, this is what it means to be a city, where you need to actually lock your doors. That's where you've transitioned from a country town to a real life city. I think the relationship between the Lambs and the Pickles is also a good indication of the religious divisions in Australia that are becoming more and more prevalent. So while Australia is nominally a Christian country, it actually didn't mean that everyone was Christian themselves. So we have a good indication here. We've got one Christian family and a non-Christian family. And you can even see, even though the Pickles aren't Christian, there are some conflicts between their nominal Christian beliefs and those of the Lambs. There's also the introduction of different cultures through the post-war migration, which we see with the immigrants arriving after World War II, the fact that Rose gets taken to a spaghetti joint, so she has Italian food for the first time, and even Quick's fish catching enterprise being based on selling to the Balts and the Greeks. This is something that would have been new for that time as well. And gender discrimination and the changing roles of women. We can particularly see this through the development of Rose. It's really interesting to see her character go from working in like a call centre to going on a date to having a relationship with a man who she's not married to, which was, of course, very, very scandalous. And then once women were married, they were expected to stop working and to have children, and that was the end of that. And in 1969, there was a judgment passed, which meant that there was equal pay for equal work. And although this happens after the end of the novel, it's interesting to see how Rose's character develops and things like that. But I think the biggest change we see in gender roles is in the fact that Rose has a relationship outside of marriage. This was unheard of in these times, and if it did happen, you then had to marry him. It was like if you had a relationship outside of marriage, you would then marry them. Otherwise, it was, there was not really any other option for women. And there's some important Indigenous history to know as well. In fact, we might look at this a little bit later. So that's a quick historical context background for you in terms of Cloudstreet. I hope that makes a bit of sense and that you got something out of it. Stay tuned for the next installment.